12-team playoff have looked like if we had one back in the 2014 season? Welcome back to the channel, guys. In this video, we're going to be going over hypothetical scenarios. In this one, we're going to start off with 2014 season. If it went from 4 teams, it was expanded all the way to 12 way back then. So we'll get started. We'll go over the same kind of rules, the automatic qualifiers, and the last at-large bids that gets in the playoff. But first, here's what the original college football playoff looked like with the top 4. Bama, Oregon, Florida State, and Ohio State were the top 4. Baylor and TCU were the first 2 teams out. Obviously, Ohio State beat Alabama, then Oregon beat Florida State, and then Ohio State beat Oregon in the national championship game. So, if this were actually 12 teams, how would this have played out? So, we're going to go over the selections first, and then we'll see who would have won. First and foremost, we're going to start with the number 1 overall seed. It would have still been Alabama. They were 12-1, the SEC champion. There's no doubt the way they finished off the season, they would have still remained number 1. Number 2 seed would have still been the Oregon Ducks, 12-1 again. They lost to Arizona in the regular season, but then beat them in the conference championship game. They would have remained as the 2 seed in this hypothetical playoff. The 3 seed would have been Florida State. I think the top 3 would have been the exact same. Florida State, how average they looked the whole season, they're still an undefeated Power 5 champion, and they were destined to be, in the top 4 at least with this. So there's no change in the top 3. Now, where this would start getting juicy and very interesting would be how 4 through 6 would have played out. And I believe the number 4 seed, the final bye, if they were a 12 team, I do believe the committee would have selected Baylor as the 4 seed. Now, Baylor and TCU and Ohio State were the 3 that were in the discussion with this. Obviously, Ohio State would have been the 5th seed, but we would have had Baylor getting the nod over Ohio State. Yes, the Big 12 did not have a conference championship game. Yes, Baylor only played 12 games. Ohio State played the 13th, and they dominated. But I do believe the committee, they would have had a little more leeway of not putting in Ohio State in the top 4 versus where they did it in this hypothetical model. So Baylor would get the nod. They were co-champs with TCU, but they also beat them head-to-head, so they would be the actual representative in this scenario. Ohio State would be 5 at 12-1. No shock. TCU would have been the 6th seed go in this tournament, and obviously Ohio State would host the first game. TCU would host a first-round matchup as well. So that is the big controversy in how the setup, I feel like, would be for 4 through 6 in this hypothetical model. Let's continue 7 through 12. The next team would be Mississippi State. They started off the first ever number 1 team in the CFP rankings back in 2014. They dropped, they lost to Alabama, and then they lost to Ole Miss down the stretch. To finish 10-2, but they still would finish at number 7 in the final rankings and get a home game. Finally, the last team to play get a home game in the first round would be Michigan State. They lost to Ohio State. They lost to Oregon earlier in the season. Those are only 2 losses. They dominated everybody else, and they were one of the underrated 10-2 teams, probably in that 3-year stretch with this 4-team playoff. So, Michigan State, Mississippi State, TCU, and Ohio State would be teams that did not get a first-round bye would host in the first round. So Michigan State would play the 9th seed, which would be Arizona, 10-3, the Pac-12 runner-up in the championship game. I still think, even though they weren't the best in most of the metrics, they still were a really good team at 10-3. Michigan State would play Arizona in the first round. Now, Mississippi State would host Georgia Tech, the loser of the ACC championship game, only lost by 2 to undefeated Florida State. Had a lot of good wins that season as well. They would go on the road, but still get in the playoff as a 10th seed. Now, the 11th seed would be Ole Miss. They beat Mississippi State down the stretch to finish 10-2. Mississippi State did more during the regular season than Ole Miss did, but they still did enough to get in the playoff as the 11th seed. And finally, the Group of 5 champion representative would have been the Boise State Broncos at 11-2 out of the Mountain West. I do believe their final ranking was like somewhere 18 or 19th. They would get the automatic bid as the last 6th team in this. We're gonna just assume that we had the top 5 Power 5 and then the one Group of 5 champions. So there'll be 6 conference champs and 6 at large. So first round matchup: Michigan State hosts Arizona, Ohio State hosts Boise State, Mississippi State hosts Georgia Tech, and then TCU hosts Ole Miss. So, what do you guys think of this one? Now we're going to go over who would win this hypothetical matchup. I'm just going to go over this quickly. We're going to see what would happen and all the metrics and what I do believe would play out with all these games. So first off, we're going to start out with Michigan State versus Arizona. I do believe Michigan State would prevail in this one. Like I said earlier, they're one of the better 10-2 teams in the CFP the entire season. I think they get it done pretty easily over Pac-12 runner-up Arizona. The 5-12 matchup, Ohio State played Boise State. I think this one's a no-brainer. Ohio State wins this pretty easily. They're not even close to even looking for it. This one is just, business. They're going to go take care of business against Boise State and then move on. Mississippi State against Georgia Tech. I do believe, even though Mississippi State hosted them, I think Georgia Tech would get the upset victory in this one. Technically an upset, 10-7. But I do believe these two played in real life in the bowl game. I don't think it would have been the blowout that it was in the bowl game, but I still believe Georgia Tech would have beat Dak Prescott and Mississippi State in the first round matchup. And finally, the last round, TCU would host Ole Miss. I mean, this is kind of a no-brainer. TCU was playing their lights out. They also played Ole Miss and beat them head-to-head. I think it was pretty dominating fashion as well. So, Michigan State gets it done over Arizona. Ohio State moves on over Boise State. Georgia Tech over 10th seed over Mississippi State, and then TCU over Ole Miss. So, quarterfinal matchups: Alabama versus Michigan State. How good Michigan State has been with that season, only two close losses to really good teams. I still think Alabama is definitely going to pull away at this one. Bama is going to win, and I do believe they go on to face the winner of Ohio State against Baylor in the Cotton Bowl, which I still think Ohio State moves on over Baylor. They kind of faltered down the stretch, Baylor did. Ohio State was just a freaking wrecking ball going into the playoffs, and I still think they would come up first round and then a quarterfinal victory over Baylor. Moving on to Georgia Tech versus Oregon in the Orange Bowl. I do believe Oregon would actually come away in this one. I don't think it's any surprise either. Georgia Tech's a good team, but Oregon, they had Mariota. They were just killing everybody, including Arizona down the stretch there. Oregon beats Georgia Tech. Finally, TCU versus Florida State in the Fiesta Bowl. I mean, Florida State was one of the worst-rated undefeated teams going into the postseason that year, and I do believe TCU was just, after that 3-point loss to Baylor in like the week 4, week 5 in October, they blew everybody out down the stretch, and I think they would beat Florida State in the quarterfinal matchup to move on to face Oregon in the Rose Bowl. So, semifinals: Alabama, Ohio State, 1 versus 5. Oregon versus TCU, 2 versus 6. So, who would win in this semifinal matchup? Alabama versus Ohio State. Well, I think history wouldn't change much, and I think Ohio State would come away again with a victory over Nick Saban. Urban Meyer led this team. That team was absolutely stacked, and they get it done to go on to the national championship game again in this hypothetical matchup. And the other side, Oregon facing TCU in the Rose Bowl. I honestly think if we had to pick a team, I think TCU would upset Oregon and move on to the national championship game, where it'd be number 5 seed Ohio State versus number 6 seed TCU, where this game would be a crazy matchup. I think TCU with Boykin and their offense against Ohio State, and they're just stacked defensive front, and their crazy offense with Zeke and Michael Thomas on the outside, and what's his name? Not Dwayne Haskins, RIP by the way. 12 gauge Cardell Jones leading them. This would have been a very, very interesting matchup, and I think would be a very close matchup. Would not be a 3-touchdown affair that Ohio State beat Oregon in the national title game. But in the end, I still believe the national champion would not be any different. I do believe Ohio State would come away in the end in the national championship game, beat TCU, and claim the first ever CFP 12-team playoff national champions. They get the trophy, bring it back to Columbus, and that's the way it would end up, guys. So, what'd you think of the video? Do you think the selection was correct? Should I put anybody else in the top 12? I mean, the 6th conference chance would have been automatically in, but who do you think was left out? You think should left in? Also, who do you think would have won this hypothetical matchup? Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Click the like button below, subscribe to the channel, and tune into next time when I do the 2015 version if we had a 12-team playoff in that year. See you next time, guys.